Hamidapa.
Yes,
Why?
I will.
No. Start with
Yes.
the chamber leader.
No, अभी तो fish out of water.
Welcome.
अरे, he was.
Welcome to this webinar on the budget. I am Tani Mahmood, special correspondent of Dhaka Tribune. We have here with us Ms. Nihat Kabir. She is the president of MCCI, also a lawyer. We have Dr. Fahmida Khatun. She is the executive director of CPD, a Dhaka-based think tank. And we have Dr. Ashikur Rahman, economist with Policy Research Institute. Right, so we'll start with the discussions. We had expected that this budget would address the corona pandemic more decisively than it has, probably, from all the reactions that happens to be out there right now. My question is that, are you disappointed with the corona-specific interventions in this budget? If yes, then why? If not, if you think it has done a good job, then do feel free to tell us why you feel so. I'll start with you, Fahmidapa.
Thank you very much for inviting me to this talk show organized by the Tribune, Dhaka Tribune. To start with your question, first of all, I would like to say that this budget which has been prepared, the context is totally different from the previous budget. All the budgets which have been prepared earlier in the history of Bangladesh. Why? Because it is well known that the impact of COVID-19 has been very distinctive on the economy during the last months. And if you remember that even before the arrival of Corona, during the first 7-8 months of the financial year 2020, some of the economic indicators were under pressure. Except for the remittance flow, the other indicators, for example, export, import, revenue mobilization, private investment, those were giving some worrying signal. Now, in that context, so the government had to strike a balance in order to revive those economic indicators, and also in order to address the fallouts of COVID-19. So there is an attempt in the budget, I would say, in terms of addressing the economic fallout and social and health related fallouts of COVID-19. And at the outset of the budget, the finance minister had mentioned that this budget has 4 strategies. So these 4 strategies basically lay out the activities which will be undertaken in the short term, in the medium term, and in the long term. So these, if we just very quickly remember those strategies, one is that at the beginning he has mentioned that the expenditure will be mainly the luxury expenditures will be reduced, it will be discouraged, and the attempt to create jobs by prioritizing government spending. And secondly, it was also mentioned that there will be loan facilities through commercial banks at subsidized rates for the affected industries and businesses, which is already in place. We are saying it has been reiterated in the budget. Thirdly, the strategy was to also expand the coverage of government's social safety network, so for social safety program, to protect those people who are under extreme poverty and those who are low paid workers in the informal sector particularly. And finally, it was also mentioned that the money supply will be increased in the economy so that there is economic revival, and that, of course, it has also been mentioned that the government will be mindful of the inflationary pressure as a result of increased money supply. So if you look at the strategies which are delineated, I would say these are very much in the right direction. But I have some of the observations regarding some of the projections made for the fiscal year 2020. To start with, if you look at the budget or the fiscal framework, then it has always been the case that our public expenditure is growing faster than the revenue mobilization. And in fact, the revenue mobilization has also been a challenge for the last couple of years. The target is very high, but the implementation is very low. And we also see that in that context, while the public expenditure is increasing because of the size of the economy is increasing, so that is very natural to have an expanded public expenditure. And in order to finance that public expenditure, the revenue mobilization effort has also been increased, the target at least. But as I have mentioned, the target has been very difficult to attain a couple of years. And this year, for the next coming fiscal year, for fiscal year 2021, the target for revenue mobilization, which is 8,000 crore taka, which to my mind and to our mind is very, very high. Why it is high? Because in the revised budget of 2020, it has been revised downward, and that is 3,48,000 crore taka. And we had, from Center for Policy Dialogue, we had earlier projected on the basis of the trend of revenue mobilization that it would be actually for the fiscal year 2020, during the current fiscal year, 2,52,800, which means that now, according to the government projection, the increase will be 8.6%. But if we see the trend and if we follow our projection of revenue mobilization this year, in the current year, so from 2,52,800 to 3,78,000 crore taka, which is a huge jump upwards, which is 49.5%, almost 50% increase. So which also means that the shortage will be, or an additional amount of 1,25,000 crore will have to be mobilized, which is really a humongous task given the current capacity and the current record of the NBR. So this is another, I would say, the mismatch regarding the projection of the whole fiscal framework. The other objective also, we have discussed before the budget also, that this year is an unusual year. So we need not think about the two things. One is we don't have to think about the budget deficit, because the public expenditure has to be increased in order to create employment in the economy, in order to give money to the hands of the people. And so it can go up to anywhere 7-8%. So in this budget, it has been projected to be 6%, which is okay. But as I have mentioned, that there might be a need for increasing more expenditure by the government. The second issue is that this is a year when we do not need to think about the GDP growth, because across the world, all the countries, including the developing, least developed countries, they all are facing either negative GDP growth rate or very low growth rate. Even if you look at India, that is projected to be having -5% GDP growth. Economy like China, huge economy, very nominal GDP growth rate. So but there's nothing to be worried. It is a worrying signal, but we don't have to be carried away by the growth number. So we see that in the fiscal year 2020, in the current year, in the revised budget, the GDP growth rate has been slashed downwards from 8.2 to 5.2%. But as has been mentioned by various international organizations, IMF, World Bank, that this growth will be about 2 to 3%. We also had projected a growth rate for fiscal year 2020. It was 2.5%. But again, for the next year, this has been projected 8.2%. Of course, when IMF projected that Bangladesh's growth will be 2%, they also projected that next year it will be 9%. Because when you have a low growth rate, because of the low base, the growth for the growth, even if it is a small number, the growth, incremental growth tends to be higher. So that was okay. But we should not get carried away with the growth number. This is one. Rather, we should have focus more on the priority areas. Of course, in the budget, these priority areas have been mentioned: health, agriculture, social safety net, all these, and employment generation. This is a very welcome initiative, I would say. But again, the required fund for these sectors in order to
I'll come back to you on the specific sectors. Let me go to the other participants, and then we'll come back to the specific sectors then. In the meantime, I welcome Mr. Rehman Subhan. Mr. Rehman Subhan has joined us. He was having difficulties with the connection, so we started without him. Sir, we were discussing about the budget, whether the budget has addressed the corona pandemic effectively or not. And Fahmida was telling us about her thoughts. What do you think about the budget? Does it address the need of the hour?
My approach to it is slightly different. I have for many years not participated in budget discussions. I think my colleagues at CPD do it with much greater competence and, in fact, spend a great deal of time and energy over this. So I would really not want to second guess them on these things. My perspective on this is that in the COVID year, this budget is more in the nature of a speculative enterprise, more designed, I think, to raise public morale than to, in fact, actually make a credible statement about the direction of the economy and the specific measures taken to, in fact, move it in that direction. My own understanding of this is that much of what is going to happen in the coming year is going to have very little to do with actually what has been laid down, both in terms of numbers and in terms of agendas in the budget, and will depend greatly on how the COVID situation shapes up and how the government effectively handles this. And this is going to be the prime determinant of how the economy works. I think Ashik is here and he has things to say about this, and I hope he will say that. What I would bring to the attention both of all of you, Naheed will be speaking on behalf of the business sector, is that specifically in terms of measures which have been taken, how will you, in fact, be ensuring that these will, in fact, really do what they are intended to do? Because the problem isn't how much of an incentive package you have been given, but how far that is going to effectively be disbursed, not so much for the wage earning part, which is the relatively easy part, but over the question of generating incentives for productive activity, because this is going to depend effectively on hundreds of thousands of both SMEs as also big entrepreneurs deciding that they will take these resources and then they will effectively invest this and activate their businesses. This is not going to depend on their choice exclusively. It will depend on how the global market is shaping up and how far the banks themselves are in a position to effectively disburse this, because they themselves in our interviews with them through the CPD have already indicated the many problems they are facing in disbursing the credit component of the loan program. The second big problem, I think, which has to be tackled over here is the whole problem of the logistics of any type of reactivation of the economy, because obviously, however active the economy is to become will depend a great deal on how easily people can move around and to do so without getting into clusters, which are in fact going to aggravate the COVID process. No one has really thought out the small print of this particular program and what will, in fact, be the consequences of this. Finally, the other thing I would want to leave you with is that the big social protection program, which has been built into the budget, this is going to be an exclusively governance problem because this is going to depend greatly on how effectively the government does its targeting, how effectively it then delivers resources without considerable rent extraction taking place by people who are involved in the delivery process, including the political intermediaries who come into the game. That again is very critical. Now, I notice that they have decided to do business as usual by disbursing a lot of the social protection through the various heads which they have identified over previous years. Now, the whole point of delivery, when you're delivering it under 10 different programs, in which you are having to itemize different categories of people, is a horrendous problem in selection and leads to a great deal of what is known as adverse selection. They, in fact, actually, for the COVID year, aggregated all these into a single delivery package in which they would agree to deliver to a large number of people without making distinctive categories between them a certain sum of money. That would have been much more easily done. So, finally, I would then say that we can all, as we do in our annual budget discussions, get preoccupied with the whole issue of numbers and with the whole issue of credibility of those numbers. I mean, I can't imagine anyone seriously think that under prevailing circumstances you are going to get anywhere near 8% growth rate, or you are in fact going to raise the sort of revenues that you intend to do. And I'm sure the finance minister, who is a perfectly sensible, practical person with a background in accountancy, very well knows that these are not really realistic figures. The relevant point I think he will have to face is, at the end of the day, what is this going to look like 6 months from now? Essentially, what he would probably need to do in 3 months' time and then in 6 months' time is to actually review how much the economy has been activated. And he will have to see how effectively resources have been disbursed to enhance our capacity to deal with COVID. Because, again, we have inherited the worst performing sector in the economy and in the administration, and they are now having to cope with the COVID without any serious capacity or preparation to do so. And we have to see whether they can deliver. I mean, if in fact we see 3 months from now that the COVID curve is continuing on its upward trajectory, I think you will have to sit down and do your sums all over again and provide everyone country with a much more realistic assessment of where under the prevailing circumstances we are heading. But I sympathize with the finance minister. I'm not sure that many people in his prevailing circumstances could have done a great deal better than that. But I think what is important is to restore some realism and to then speak frankly and candidly to the people rather than to, in fact, feed them with a bit of pie taken from the sky. So I think I'll wind up my comments and let all of you carry on. You are more informed on this than I am, and I'll be happy to listen to what you have to say. Thank you.
Dr. Ashikur Rahman, I want to come to you, and I'll just add something here. This year, we were expecting large interventions and budgetary measures for health, naturally, to deal with COVID-19. Now, this year's sectoral outlay, if you look at it, you'll find that public administration has 19.9%, which is about 20%, so 1/5. Education and technology has 15.1%. Interest payment is 11%. Transport and communication, that has not been reduced at all. It is still at 11.4%. Even defense is at 6.1%, while health is 5.1% of the total outlay. With that in perspective, would you give us your thoughts?
Thank you. I think I will take a cue from Rehman Subhan sir. First, before I say anything, I want to pay my condolences to all the frontline workers we are losing every day, the doctors, the nurses, the police, the armed forces. I think they're doing their bit for our country, and we should all ask, are we doing enough for them? And I think, we have to look at the bigger picture before I come to that question of allocation you're asking. That what is the context of this present budget? I think the context is very simple. That we have to save as many lives as possible, that we have to stand by the groups who are vulnerable, and we have to ensure that when this virus is contained, we have a stable and inclusive economic recovery. Now, as Subhan sir said, that I am also sympathetic towards the challenges of the finance minister, because this budget was formulated under two uncertainties. At the world level, we don't know whether the world will have a V-shaped recovery or not, or whether we will see another second wave of the virus. And, many tout and say that there might be a W-shaped recovery, that they might go for another lockdown. So we don't know what will happen at the world stage. And at the domestic sector, we still don't have any understanding of when we will control this virus or contain this virus. And everything, as Rehman sir said, that until unless we have an understanding of when the virus comes to an end, everything till then is a speculative exercise. I mean, we have known unknowns and unknown unknowns, because this, as I keep saying, that this pandemic is been a black swan moment for Bangladesh. If you look at all the policy documents that have been written, the 8th plan, the 7th plan, the 2020 plan, the Delta plan, none of the plans in Bangladeshi economic management uttered the word pandemic, because we never expected one. So I understand that challenges. So given that context, what we have to be is we have to be adaptively efficient. I think we have to adapt, and we have to address those challenges of understanding that we have to first stop the virus. And then if we are thinking really seriously about the economy, we can only do it when we have contained the virus. There's a layman notion out there that somehow we have to live with this virus as if it is diabetes or HIV positive. I completely reject that narrative, that this virus is not diabetes, that we have to live with it. I think there's no living with it. We have to contain the virus and then think about the economy. So from that standpoint, I believe the Ministry of Finance is telling us that in the budget document that we're going to have a 8.2% growth. I mean, it's like the Ministry of Finance is assuming that the entire intelligentsia does not have any intelligence, because you're practically telling us that in last 49 years, we're going to have the highest economic growth in a year when we haven't yet contained the pandemic, which is kind of hilarious in some sense, a tragic comedy. And I also say that the basic architecture, you see, that we're still talking about revenue growth. If you look at the last 10 years revenue growth in NBR, that's a 15% revenue growth. And if you use that to extrapolate last 2 years growth, then we are not going to get anything more than 255 to 270,000 crore taka this year. That's the, even if you use that 15% average, but this year was 8%. So if you use 8%, it's going to be even more bad. So so I think pretty much unanimously, we have not accepted the revenue growth target or the GDP growth target. But I will say that there is an attempt to accommodate this pandemic through the fact that allocations are increased for the health sector. And there is a 10,000 crore taka pandemic fund. If you add that, that is 1.3% of GDP. And 13 line ministries will be trying to address that pandemic crisis, even though citizens still don't know what that plan is. I mean, we are told, I had this webinar 3 weeks ago here, I think, and I pleaded that there should be a strict lockdown because generally the economic activity after the Eid is very low. So we could have had a lockdown at a very low economic cost, but we didn't do that. But now, and there was a thinking that we should open up wholesale or gradual. But I am thankful that the government has kind of reverted back from that wholesale opening up doctrine and now planning to find this balance between life and livelihood through these zonal lockdown. And I keep saying that I'm not a pandemic expert. If it works, if it works. If it does not, we go more strict. But yes, so the health allocations are there to contain the pandemic. Along with those, I think the income tax bracket has been increased, which shows that there is a recognition that people who don't have enough income might not be able to pay the taxes. One area that I feel has been kind of neglected, which has had its history of governance challenges, is the banking sector. I am increasingly doubtful that whether, our banking sector faces this threat of servicing short-term deposits with long-term loans. And now we have this problem of this pandemic, which is still not controlled. So over the next 6 months, I actually don't know how much the banking sector can cope with this pressure of loan defaults and whether that area needs to be addressed. And that area is blank in this current budget. Because if you don't, I know when we talk about banking sector, the word governance comes up because it is an area where government has governance challenges has been a pandemic in its own right. But even so, I feel that to make the economic recovery stable and inclusive, we have to look at the most vulnerable sectors, and we also have to look at these institutions which will take the frontal wave of the economic what can I say, shocks, if the loan defaults keep happening over the next 6 months. As I said, I am not too hopeful that the economy will pick up in the next 6 months, which creates, doubt that how we will manage it. But as I said, that if we rely by the principle of adaptive efficiency, then I will not look at these allocations as seriously as you're doing, Tanim Bhai, because I think the need of the moment will decide where we should put our money. And I feel at this moment that next 3 months will give us a lot of clear signal. I agree with Fahmida Appa. I don't have expectations that the revenue targets will be met. I reject the revenue targets lock, stock, and barrel. I don't think none of those revenue targets or growth targets will be met, but I don't think that's a problem. I think we should be bold in printing money if we need it, because I think there is a deflationary pressure. If we have to borrow from the central bank, then we should borrow from the central bank. We should see the private credit growth of the banking sector over the next 3 months. If the private credit growth in the banking sector is not very good, then I don't even mind borrowing from the banks, because the banks need to survive. And if the government borrows from the bank and the private sector is not, because they're being too careful for the next 6 months, it allows them to hedge their bets, and we don't have crowding out. So if you ask me, in short, we have to navigate this storm, and we have to navigate this storm very skillfully. And unlike any previous budgets before, we have to be on our toes for the next 3 months. But let me finish this episode by saying one thing, and I think it has not been appreciated by the policymaker. Japan, and I keep saying it, that Japan and Germany, even after facing a World War defeat in 1945, they could rebuild the economy only because the war ended. Bangladesh needs to see an end of this pandemic war. We need to see an end, and we need to have a timeline in which we know that we can have a control or a lever over this pandemic. Without that, the entire notion of living with this pandemic and having some sort of economic recovery while the pandemic is on is a hubris to me for at this moment.
Thank you. Nihadapa, a lot depends on the business community, and that has to do with the economic recovery. Businesses resuming, new businesses perhaps opening up, old ones flourishing. And this budget was, everyone was looking at this budget to see what kind of measures there were that would provide incentives. How have they been? Is that satisfactory? Is it going to help the recovery, or is it trying to provide adequate incentives? What's your take?
Well, let me start from a slightly different point. There's always an expectation that, business will do well if it is given particular incentives and this and that. But as the speakers before me have said, and very rightly, that until and unless we have some sort of a control over this infection, this virus, until and unless we have a very large part of the country where people are free of infection and are able to go back to social and economic interactions without fear, business will not start again. We have seen that we said that, okay, everything is going to be opened up. It's now been since 31st of May, it's what, today, 10 days. I don't think more than 30% of people are out and about going around and working. One of the things is, the five of us are sitting in our homes and talking. We are not going anywhere. Until and unless we have a healthy population, business is not going to work. There's this expectation that business is something separate. It's not. We are very much a part of the everyday lives of people. So when coming from that point of view, the first thing I want to say is that there's been quite a bit of talk about there not being enough allocation for the health sector. Now, a few weeks ago, I had to deliver a paper on law and governance at the time of crisis. And when there is a sudden crisis, governance, the lack of governance in sectors and all that comes out very, very starkly. And we have seen that in the health sector. It doesn't matter what the allocations were in the past. Whatever the allocations were, if they had been used for properly and efficiently for the purpose they had been meant, and moreover, if the management systems had been properly put in place, I don't think we would have been in this situation, even with the resources that had already been allocated in this sector. I'll just give you one example. Even today, 3 months down the road, people who are suspected of COVID infection are having to go and stand in line with hundreds of other people for 3 to 4 hours to try and give samples for tests. Now, if they're not sick, they'll fall sick. If they're sick, they'll transmit the disease to another 10 people like that. This is a management failure. It is not a resource failure. So that is one point that I really want to make quite strongly. So the allocation part of it, we have strange expectations of the budget. We think the budget is going to be a very articulate, sort of novel piece of literature where great statements of policy are going to be made. It's not. There's a formulaic way of presenting it. There are certain facts and figures which come out. The growth figure, we've talked about that. We don't want to be hung up on that. The budget deficit figure, we've said from MCCI several times, 5.6%, 5.8%, whatever you have said, if it is necessary, go up to 8%, go more. Because your prudent management, the government's prudent macroeconomic management, for which they must be appreciated, has given us the headroom in this crisis to go and spend more, to go and get money from wherever we can, without, in the long term, harming our economic growth and our economic growth prospects. I think that if we can get our population healthy, the sooner our economy will rebound. Today, this whole argument about life and livelihood are not binary choices. They're just not. And to say that if I keep things closed down today for 15 days, people are going to die, no, it is not going to happen. I am telling you from the private sector perspective, a single person is not going to die of hunger. But if we don't do something about this infection, our trading partners will not come back to us and work with us, our international trading partners. And I've already said, domestically, our economy will not take off because our service industry, we can work at from home. Our manufacturing industry, people have to be out on the fields. Certain parts of it, agriculture has been working, essential goods, the transport has been working, but a very, very, very large segment is not able to go back to work. We have to bear that in mind. Now, as far as the specific incentives in the budget, I think in this year's budget, the finance minister, despite many challenges, has taken the steps in the right direction. As Professor Rehman Subhan said, how effective they are, we will see when they're implemented. But you will have seen that the tax for the corporates, the non-listed companies, the tax rate has been reduced by 2.5%. Our tax rate, corporate tax rate, is comparatively much higher than our neighboring countries and our regional competitors. And also in this very difficult time, it will give a measure of relief, but there are some other things which also have to be done. For example, advance income tax of 5% has to be brought down to 3% if we really want effective relief. Yet, this is a positive step. For the first time in many, many years, a finance minister has gone ahead and done it. So I have to congratulate him on it. And I have to hope that over the next few years, he will bring the rate down to something in the region of what our regional countries have. The private, for individuals, the tax rates have come down, as well as the slabs have been increased, and the tax-free income threshold has been increased. Again, it is a step in the right direction, because the only way we are really going to kickstart this economy, I'm sorry, I'm speaking in the presence of two very eminent economists and one soon to be very eminent economist, and I'm only a lawyer, but unless we increase dramatically our aggregate demand in the domestic market, we are not going to be able to kickstart our economy. So if we need to do that, we need to get cash in the hands of people. And I think these are steps which at least show that the government is looking in that direction. But before signing off for this particular topic, what I would like to say is this, that we have seen an enormous amount of wastage and pilfering and other things in government expenditure. It has become very, very stark during these last 3 months of the crisis. If that can be stopped, and also in the previous year, we have seen all the various stories which have come out. If that can be stopped, then a lot of money will be saved, which can reduce the burden on domestic resource mobilization as well. From a business point of view, we are always very worried when there is an extraordinarily high domestic revenue target, because those of us who pay taxes, we fear that we will get squeezed more and more and more. I would like to request the government to look at the tax administration very carefully, to find people, and there are many, many more now in Bangladesh, who actually have quite high levels of taxable income, but who don't pay tax. Please get hold of them and make them pay the tax. And finally, don't necessarily believe your own story about what you will get in domestic revenue. Work to mobilize funds from our overseas, our multilateral development partners and our bilateral development partners, so that our budget deficit can be financed through fairly cheaply available funds. So I'll stop there for the moment.
Fahmida, two things. The revenue collection has been discussed, and people have said it is ridiculous. It is absolutely impossible to achieve this level of revenues. and it is not going to happen. Now, given that, the proposed budget, it proposes that VAT should contribute 37.9% of total NBR income, as opposed to only 31.5% of income tax. So income taxpayers would be paying 31.5% of NBR income, and the entire people, all the people, the VAT would contribute 37.9%. I wanted to have your thoughts on that. Also, domestic borrowing is increasing, and it's increased this year too. How is that going to affect the economy?
Thank you. First of all, regarding the resource mobilization through income tax and VAT, you see, as has been mentioned by the previous speaker, that the issue here during COVID-19 is the issue of increasing the governance, increasing the institutional capacity, because we have been formulating the budget, but the whole issue of implementation has been an unresolved area. And in case of revenue mobilization also, the huge target in my previous section, I spoke about the revenue target and revenue mobilization effort in details. But what I feel, without reform in the NBR and the whole tax system, it is not possible to possible to meet up the targets which have been laid out in the budget. And we know that in case of revenue collection, in case of VAT, there's VAT online project which is being implemented, though there has been a lot of resistance, but it has started at a limited scale. The other project, which is also being implemented by the support of the World Bank, that is National Single Window Project, that is also being implemented. So projects like these, which will increase the efficiency of the NBR, is very important, because firstly, you need to have adequate human resources in the department, and secondly, the trained and skilled human resource development, and then the implementation or the utilization of the technology, the use of the technology. We have been talking about digital Bangladesh, use of technology, but this is an area where if we could utilize and implement the technology, then it could have been more efficient. If we look at the issue in this area, in case of India, we see that Aadhaar card, which incorporates so many information and brings together in one place, which is connected with many institutions. So if NBR and the bank accounts and the ID card and all these informations were connected, this tax evasion would have been much, much less. So this is one, that reform agenda which has been mentioned even in the previous budget also. And in this budget also, the finance minister has mentioned that they started the reform, but due to COVID-19, they had to stop. But I don't understand why, because of COVID-19, that reform agenda has to be stopped, because this is a totally different department, and they're not related to the health risk management area. So we have been shying away from the reform issue. So the target you have mentioned, that yes, in a progressive tax system, the direct tax should be the main source of income, source of revenue mobilization. But we have been seeing that in recent period, of course, the increase of direct tax has been quite good, and this should be the trend. But as I have mentioned, without reform, it is difficult. The other issue of financing the budget, you have rightly mentioned, that the financing of budget has to come from domestic sources and also from the external sources. Now, in case of domestic sources, we have seen the dependence of the government on the banking system has been increasing in an alarming rate, because in the current fiscal year, in 2020, we have seen that has been almost doubled. The target has been about 42,000 crore taka to take loans from the bank by the government, but it has reached about 82,000 thousand crore. Now, in this budget, also in the coming budget, the target has been set as 86,900 something, so almost 87,000 crore taka. So the reliance on bank borrowing is alarming in the sense that during a COVID year, the demand and the need for the private sector, the small, medium, and big businesses, and also the other affected industries is very large. And we have seen that already the banks are struggling to create liquidity. The central bank has taken some monetary policy measures by reducing the cash reserve ratio, by reducing repo, and by increasing the ADR, advanced deposit rate, but that is not enough. The banks themselves have to create liquidity to support the stimulus package which has been announced. And 82%, almost 82% of the whole stimulus package is dependent on the banking system. So if the government borrows from the banking system, there will be a crowding out effect for the private sector. So this has to be borne in mind. The other source of supporting the deficit finance, deficit budget is the National Savings Certificate. Here we see only a nominal increase, and about 20,000 crore will come from the sales of National Savings Certificate. I feel that there could have been an opportunity to increase this target. But of course, having said that, we also have to remember that during this COVID period, the income of people, those who save or invest in saving certificate, that might have reduced, and there may not be so much optimism in terms of increasing the savings, increasing the borrowing from the sale of saving certificate. Then the issue of the external support, the other part will come from the external support. In case of external support, there is this allocation for or the projection of about $11 billion. But you see, what happens that in every budget, a huge amount of the foreign support, foreign aid remains unutilized because of lack of utilization, and because of also utilization without corruption. So a huge amount is in the pipeline. If we cannot implement the projects efficiently on a fast track basis and without corruption, then the disbursement and more foreign aid will not come. So that is why this year, there might be another opportunity. Of course, we are discussing that the opportunity from the international organizations, that those which have created a COVID fund. For example, the International Monetary Fund, they have a COVID fund of about $1 trillion. But you see what is happening here, that we are giving a wrong signal. Here we are saying that we don't have problem with our GDP growth. It is marginally lower than the projected in 2020, and we are going to recover within 1 year and have a growth of 8.2%. And we are also, in terms of, I think, COVID affected cases, I'm not sure, but there is an apprehension that the underreporting might be there. So if we are projecting a rosy picture, then these international organizations will calculate on the basis of the affected economy. So we will be losing the opportunity to access those funds. The funds which we should have been originally getting, we will be getting now less than that, because we are not giving a right signal, right estimate. We are giving a wrong estimate of the economic performance. So that is why the financing issue will be really a very, very difficult issue this year and in the coming year. But however, we have to also accumulate all the sources. Firstly, that there are many projects in the annual development program which can be scratched, because those projects which do not create adequate employment, and those projects which have just started, those may wait for some time. This is one. The other issue is that the administrative cost can be reduced substantially. In India, all the government departments have been instructed to reduce their administrative cost by 60%. And if we also take a drive that we will reduce our administrative cost by 50%, then that will create a huge amount of resources. The other source of resources, of course, the lower price of oil in the international market, that has created a cushion for us, and the profit of the BPC, that money can also be utilized for supporting, for financing the budget and the requirement of the COVID affected sectors. So, and then the last, of course, resort would be to rely on the central bank. That should be the last resort, because why I'm saying, because of the precondition for going for printing money or relying on the central bank is that you have to have good governance. If you do not have, there is every possibility that this money will be misused. And in a year of COVID-19, every penny counts. So I would not suggest that we should think of right away that should be the last one.
Thank
So
you, Pamitha.
these are yes.
Let me go to Ashikur Rahman, and as you were mentioning before, more than sectoral allocations, you were looking at the bigger picture first. And as Pamitha was mentioning, this is the COVID year, and we were expecting, or it might have been prudent for some austerity measures. In your opinion, do you see effective austerity measures in the budget?
I'm not. I didn't hear your question. Can you repeat your question, please?
As Pamitha was mentioning, austerity measures could have given us a bit of a more cushion to spend in this COVID year, save some money. Do you see effective austerity measures in the budget?
Look, as I keep saying, I don't see these allocations as seriously as many people do. I have 2 points of at least 1 point of disagreement with Dr. Fahmida, which is I don't think that borrowing from the banks is a very bad strategy in this COVID year, because I am not afraid of crowding out. I personally don't know any businessman who wants to increase investments in the next 6 months or 1 year. So that would basically mean that the banks would be sitting with deposits, but no one to lend to, which will create a servicing problem. So for me, borrowing from the banks, at least if you watch the first 3 months credit growth to the private sector, and if you see that the private sector credit growth is not very high, and the private sector deposit growth is also not very high, then if the public sector borrows from the bank, it does give the banking sector a cushion. And I'm telling you, our banks will come under a lot of stress within the next 6 months. We have not registered that fact in this budget. We have not registered that fact in the discourse that we are currently having. The second issue that I want to highlight is, last 10 years, give or take, governance challenges have been there, but we have done very well economically. We have lifted 13 million people out of poverty. We have nearly reached $2,000 per capita income. And these are, good achievements over the last 10 years. But this COVID will create new poor. And I think that's an agenda that was also not very systematically thought of. The idea of this new poor is because that, look, if there are new poor, basically it means the good news is that they had inherent capabilities, as Professor Amartya Sen says, to come out of poverty. So if a shock has pushed them to poverty, then there needs to be a systematic thinking about how to reach out to the new poor and help them have that ladder to come out of poverty again. One of the silver lining of this COVID year has been that our elites have bypassed the health problem. And for the first time in 3 decades, the rich and the poor are facing a very underperforming health sector. And I hope that, in times to come, people enjoying private jet exit strategy, leaving them aside, I think, we will see this health sector with much more seriousness, because it is no longer a sectoral issue. It is also an issue of social justice. I think what this health sector, people dying on the street without oxygen, without treatment, has shown us again and again in this year that what is the state of social justice in Bangladesh. And you can't have, you can't, no matter how rosy your economics look, no matter how rosy you make your economy look, if you can't establish social justice, then the point of having a civilized country is gone out of the window. And I think this pandemic, if anything, we know, we have navigated many problems, we have kept many problems under the carpet. But this pandemic has shown that when you undermine a sector such as health sector for so long, and something as this happens, apart from those few people who flew off with their private jets, we are all in this together. As John Maynard Keynes said, we're all stuck in this together. And we need to figure out a new social contract, a new economic contract after this pandemic. And we have to think about the inclusive aspect of the economic recovery very seriously. It's not just about bailing out the big businesses and bailing out the big banks. It's also about the SMEs and the common man who wants to have a hope in this country, that they live in a country where there's basic fairness. So I will have this departure from, the general discussion on governance we have every year. This year, we cannot get all the reforms done, period. We will not be able to solve all the governance done, period. I accept that without any problem. But this year, we have to ensure that the pandemic is contained with a hammer and people find the economic chance to regain economic strength. I think those two should be our focused areas. And there are two, there's one silver lining we have and one problem we have. The silver lining we have is a very low public debt to GDP ratio. That has been our cushion. We can use that cushion, as Nihat Kabir has said. We have been fiscally prudent for a long time. We have given ourselves that cushion. We should use that cushion to help the most vulnerable group. And the art is here. How do you create short-term capital that turns into sustainable long-term debt? And I think challenge. How do you create short-term capital that creates sustainable long-term debt? And managing that, I think managing that will test our capabilities in the economic front. But the downside is, as Fahmida Appa correctly said, our tax to GDP ratio has been one of the lowest in the world. We will create long-term debts, but those debts will need servicing at some point. And when we come out of this COVID, we cannot be a country where we use a regressive tax framework to get, as you correctly said, that to get the tax revenue mostly from the poor, where only few million people have TIN certificate. I think that is an area that we must seriously address when this COVID crisis is over. I can't hear you again.
Tanim, your mic needs to be unmuted, please.
Sorry. Right. Nihat Appa, I wanted to come to you. Do you agree with Ashikur Rahman when he says that domestic borrowing would not really affect much because banks will be sitting with deposits and with no businesses to borrow this year?
Again, let me sort of start answering from a slightly different point of view, and I'll come to that because that's one of the points I wanted to make. First of all, I very respectfully beg to respond slightly differently to the question you posed to both Fahmida Appa and Ashik, which is, I don't want austerity. What I want is discipline in government spending. I don't want what in Bengali we would say opobai opochoy. What I want is that what the allocations have been made for, they should be spent effectively, efficiently, and without wastage. Because money needs to go into the economy. And if this money goes in, and as I've mentioned in my earlier intervention, that with discipline, we can actually find more money within our budget itself for effective spending. Secondly, I also have a point of slight disagreement with Ashik on the issue of reforms. Because I think in the last 3 months, we have seen what the governance failures are on the government side, and also we have seen, additionally, what regulations, what excessive regulations, paperwork, etc., we can do without. And if we take that lesson forward, then at least for the private sector, for the business, ease of doing business and cutting down the cost of doing business, we can actually take those lessons forward and get some good results. Now, I'm going to make very quickly some of these points, and including the point about the borrowing from the bank. Before going on to that, one thing that we have found missing from MCCI in the budget is a clear articulation of what we are going to do to recover the jobs which were there just before the pandemic and have been lost, also to create new jobs and also reskill and upskill our workers who have come in, our expatriate workers, so that they can find work within the country, and when it is feasible, they can go back out to other host countries. Secondly, the stimulus packages, and this is where the point about crowding out comes in. The stimulus packages, actually the cash infusion by the government is very little. There's 30,000 crore for large industry, there's 20,000 crores for MSME, there are further 5,000 crores for agriculture, another 5,000 for the wage element of export industries, which I'm not going into. The banks have faced difficulties in disbursing because of the complications in the rules and regulations and the SROs which were issued, firstly. Secondly, the banks are obviously scared of the credit risk. In a situation where I know the economy is going to be in bad shape, where I know that it is likely that my borrower is not going to be able to pay me back, the government is asking me to take the credit risk. I'm not going to do it. I personally sit on the board of a bank, and a fairly prudent bank, and there is resistance to this. So we have asked the government and Bangladesh Bank to come up with at least an 80% credit guarantee scheme, whereby the entire burden, the risk burden, does not fall on the banks. If that is done, and if also there's another problem with the lending to the the small and the cottage and micro through banking channels, a lot of them don't have bank accounts. So there's no point in saying that you're going to give money to them through the banking channels. You have to involve channels like NGOs, like MFIs, who actually go out and deal with these people on a day-to-day basis. If that is done, then there will be a need for credit. We think that private sector credit growth today is at historically a low level. It will not absolutely shoot up in the next few months because of the economic realities, because of the global demand situation, because of the domestic demand situation. But if the government does take out the 80,000 odd crores that it is budgeting to from the banking sector, yes, there is a possibility that at some point there will be crowding out. We need to keep a very close watch on that, and we don't want that to happen. In relation to this, I would like to ask the government that, look, put some of your own skin into the game. What is happening now in these stimulus packages, the government is saying that half of the interest element is going to be given by the government. I think the government needs to make money available from the treasury. Put money directly into the economy through whatever its welfare, social welfare and other measures are. 2 points of very serious objection that MCCI has regarding the provisions outlined in the budget, and I must refer to them. One is this whitening of black money. We have done it in the past. It has actually not resulted in a great deal of money coming back into the economy, but it has tainted our image that we are a country which is prepared to accept. And we have, this time, we have seen that black money can go directly into bank account. If that happens, our bank will not be able to interact with international banks because of violations of anti-money laundering, international anti-money laundering and KYC regulations. Our banking system will be in serious difficulty. Finally, there's been a good provision that over-invoicing and under-invoicing, if that is found in imports and exports, these will be penalized heavily. Fine. What I want to say is, what about the known culprits who have walked away from this country with proven, they have walked away, they have taken away millions and millions and millions from this country. What is being done to go after them effectively and get that money back? This over-invoicing, under-invoicing thing needs to be looked at, but it should not become something with which to harass businesses. And it should not become something which will be used as another stick to beat us with. There are agencies which are charged with stopping money from going out of this country. We want to see them working properly and effectively in the coming year. Having said that, the final thing I want to say is a request to the government: don't get hung up on your figures of growth, deficit, inflation, etc. Look after the citizens this year. Give us a healthy citizenry. The citizens will pay you back by bringing the economy back into full flow at the fastest possible speed. We will do it because that is what we do.
Thank you, Nihalava. I wanted to come back to Mr. Rehman Subhan, but I think we've lost him again. But right, so yes, well, it was wonderful having you here, and I think it was a very good discussion. Much to think about and a lot to take back. Thank you very much for being with us, and that will be all.
Thank you all. Thank you very much. It was great to be here.
Thank you. Stay safe.
Thank you.
Sir, back.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Rehman sir is here. We should have a final word from him.
Yes.
Sir is here.
Oh, yes. Sir, I wanted to come back to you for a final word about the budget and the pandemic and what we should be going about, how we should be going about to address this.
Okay, so what has been going on in Vietnam? Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Can you hear me? Yeah.
Yes, we can hear you.
I would suggest that you visit what's happening in Vietnam. Both, of course, I mean, their handling of the pandemic has been a sort of global role model, but also now, of course, it is leading to significant economic recovery. In fact, I noticed that in the last month, the export figures, in fact, actually showed an upward trajectory. And of course, what all our exporters of RMG may take notice of is that also in the last few days, Vietnam has finally concluded a free trade agreement with the European Union, which has got very significant implications for Bangladesh, because the EU has in fact been our principal market for garments and including for some of our other exports. So in a situation where in fact what I would now regard as our principal competitor in the international market has in fact effectively got on top of the pandemic. In fact, they are now down to zero deaths in opening up, and are in fact now resuming their upward trajectory in the export market. We are in fact going to have some very serious problems to deal with. And the principal problem is going to still remain that whereas they are down to zero, we are still on the upward trajectory of the curve. And that itself is going to be very central in the whole business of one step forward, two steps backward, is really not going to be very helpful. The last point I wish to make over here is, of course, the social justice problem. Now, she pointed out that we have discovered that COVID is a quite democratic disease, and in fact has been somewhat indiscriminate in the way it has actually targeted all classes of people. But obviously, by definition, the overwhelming burden has fallen on the least privileged. And what you have, of course, discovered now is that the public health system, which has been the central vehicle for dealing with this, has, of course, been totally neglected, largely because the elite class, including now the legislating and political class, have in fact abandoned the public health sector for many years. And so no one has the faintest idea now of what is actually going on in our public health institutions. I should imagine that if in fact they were to be exposed in some way, those who are seeking election, to in fact actually be mandated to in fact avail of public health services, so that they would get a sense of what common people actually have to face, we will in fact get a better appreciation. But I think it is many years since any discussion in Parliament has gone on about the quality of services available in the public health sector. Because if all MPs and the elite and everyone else is in a position to go and avail of private sector healthcare and, more important, international healthcare around the world, there really is going to be no compulsion to do anything about what is happening. And a pandemic may have opened our eyes up, but we also suffer from short-term memory loss. And so, in fact, the chances of going back to business as usual are high. So my final remark would be, well, are we going to see now not just much larger allocations, but a huge improvement in the way in which the health sector is actually governed? And we will only do it if, in fact, sufficiently large numbers of public representatives are, in fact, exposed to having to utilize these services. Okay. Otherwise, it's been a good discussion, and I think I've learned a lot.
Thank you, sir. And with that, we'll conclude. Stay safe. Goodbye.
Okay.
Thank you to everyone.
Thank you.
Okay.